All right, Mike. Like I said, I really appreciate it. I know, just to kind of start off, and I got my Bronx gym shirt on today.
There you go.
One of the things for me of doing this, and I can't remember how much I really text you about it, is, it's kind of turning into like a little bit of a podcast. I'm not gonna like promote it and try to make a bunch of money off it or anything like that. But it's just something for me to help myself and help the young coaches that I'm now getting a chance to influence, because without you and Rigo, and James and Lee, those of you that I got to work with at the Yankees, like without giving me that opportunity, like I wouldn't I wouldn't be in the role that I'm in now, and I wouldn't be able to now be kind of a mentor to younger coaches and things like that. So that's kind of the whole genesis of why I'm doing this. And it's because of people like you and coaches like you that I've been around, that really kind of, you know help me continue to take the right steps in my coaching journey. So I really appreciate that, and I appreciate you getting on here. So thank you, first of
Um,
all.
no problem. Happy to do it.
So kind of just give us a little bit of a background on like what you're doing at Acumen, what your kind of role and stuff is there, what your path has been to getting there. Obviously, I know a little bit of it, and I know
Mhm.
actually on here you kind of put a lot of information, but kind of just give us like your story of where you're from and what got you to being in your position now.
Yeah, so kind of me from kind of the Yankees days, and then I think once you have a couple kids and that lifestyle and that amount of work starts to take a toll a little bit. So when you're getting one day off, and sometimes you don't get that one day off because some big leaguer needs to go play catch for 10 minutes, you kind of start to be like, all right, well, I got two little kids now, so we we moved back here in the end of 2019, so kind of right before COVID. Left my role at the Yankees. Didn't really have anything really set here when we moved, but didn't really matter because nobody really worked for about 6 months, I would say, in that year. So eventually got on with Acumen here, and it kind of like a background on the company itself. It started as a private orthopedic surgeon. It was just basically giving people other options because, as people may know, it's public health care up here, and wait times for surgeries are starting to get pretty astronomical. Like you can be waiting 2 years at least for surgery. So and that doesn't include all your whole rehab process as well. So it's kind of just a long thing. So they kind of saw a kind of a niche market where like he's an orthopedic surgeon, so it was elbows, shoulders, and knees basically. Um, we have a athletic trainer or ATC, Leanne Gullett. She is from the Northeast, so she's from just outside of Boston. So did all her schooling there. Did a internship with Cressy way back in the day, so has a pretty good baseball background, and kind of I shot my resume around a little bit up here, and she kind of saw it, and we met, and kind of was a pretty good fit from kind of what she was doing, because she was trying to kind of implement kind of a PA-ish model with the surgeon here, and she got to the point where she's like, I got too many people. I can do some of the strength and conditioning, but I can't fulfill everything that I need to do. So she brought myself on, just kind of seeing what my background was, and it's kind of just built from there. I think we're up to 9 private surgeons now. Just the demand is there for different things. I think we have 3 orthopedics, but then we're getting into foot and ankle and spine and general and kind of all that stuff, just because there's a need for it. So my role has kind of progressed a little bit within this company. I think once I left baseball, I was pretty tired, to say the least, as far as managing people and whatnot. Because I mean, as you know, we had 300 players, 10 coaches that was kind of somewhat responsible for. So I just kind of just got back to the point where I just want to coach again. Like I don't want to be in charge of everything. But kind of, as you know, that tends to kind of go away once you start seeing things done, and you're kind of like, well, I would kind of have a few different opinions here, and I think things can be done a slightly different way. So that this role has kind of progressed to my current role now as the health and performance coordinator. So kind of oversee. There's kind of two sides to the business. There's the health side, which is the surgical side, and then we have our reconditioning and performance side, which is going to be your more prototypical kind of ATC, strength and conditioning type stuff. So we do everything from team training, semi-private, one-on-one, and then obviously like one of my biggest roles is kind of facilitating all that stuff. We have 3 other coaches in 2 different facilities, one in Calgary as well. But then kind of the return to play protocols, our testing protocols for upper extremity, lower extremity. So we do a lot of ACLs and shoulders and stuff like that. So kind of getting into that realm a little bit, but kind of it allows me to kind of, honestly, it's not that much different than what I was doing my last probably 4 years with the Yankees as rehab coordinator. Kind of that pass off from the PT to strength and conditioning, then kind of getting them back on the field. I would say that's definitely an area, at least up here, that is quite underserved as far as people having the knowledge that have done it before. I think there's a ton of PTs, but I think that knowledge of getting them, okay, you're good, you're been cleared by the doc, cleared by the PT, go to your strength coach, but how do you get back to on the field, and what's the gold standard in doing that? Which I think, as you know, there's not a ton of great research out there, especially when you talk about like ACLs and stuff like that. Kind of once you get to about 6 months, it's good, and then after that, there's nothing that's really concrete. It's like, this is kind of how you should do stuff. So I think a lot of that is just experience based, and I've seen this work before. So yeah, that's kind of my role now, is kind of similar to what I was doing before, but then obviously facilitating all the other one-on-ones and all that other stuff that you kind of normally see in like a typical private facility.
So, first of all, were you still, when did the Yankees hire Cressy? Did you get to work with him at all?
No. So
That was like the next
they
year
started, yeah, they kind of started their big shift probably the year I was leaving. So
Okay.
there was a big change organizationally, not in just strength and conditioning. I would say it was a lot of hitting, a lot of pitching. There was a big turnover, put it that way. And then he came in, I think, the year of COVID. Yeah, so like he came in kind of the year after I left, I believe, and then he's kind of been there ever since. And I think there's been I was actually just back down in Florida for the break and got to see a bunch of the guys. I actually had lunch with Rigo and got to see guys I hadn't seen in about 5 years or so. So it was nice to see. And then some guys are still there, some guys aren't. But again, I guess apparently they've had another big turnover with pitching and hitting. So just kind of the way baseball works is
Right.
if you don't win the World Series, stuff changes. So
Yeah. So with Acumen, how much, you mentioned obviously you're handling like the day to day and things like that. Like what kind of athletes are you specifically like getting to coach and work with? Is it a lot of high school? I mean, I don't know how the college kind of athletics works in Canada.
yeah,
Is it professionals? Like what's kind of the breakdown of the population of people that are coming into your guys' place?
it's I mean, basically everything under the sun. I would say our bread and butter is kind of your weekend athlete, your weekend warrior. From we'll say the surgical side, because again, if people are paying out of pocket for surgery, it's not cheap. I would say, like, you're talking tens of thousands of dollars for surgeries. So I think you have to have a certain amount of means just to be able to kind of facilitate that. So a lot of people, weekend warriors, trying to get back to golf, trying to get back to running, skiing, kind of all those type of things. And then I think the other big piece of that is kind of high school, college athletics, but kind of for the same purpose, right? Where, like, if you're up here and you blow out your ACL, well, a lot of people now are being like, well, okay, I'm just going to pay for my kid to come get an ACL surgery here and have the full kind of rehab process, rather than kind of trying to piecemeal the whole thing together. So I'd say from the athletic surgical side, it's a lot of high school age, actually a lot of high school females, soccer probably being the most as far as ACLs go, which is probably, if you look at the literature, that's pretty typical. We also have 3 academies that we program for from the baseball side. So I have managed to kind of dip into that quite a bit. So I'd say we probably have about just over 200 athletes, I would say, that we program for in one way, shape, or form. We have one group that comes in like a true off-season program where they come in 4 days a week and kind of do that stuff. So we're kind of in the middle of that right now with that one group. There's another one that'll come in just for testing, and then we'll kind of go out there. They're about 30 minutes outside town, so we'll go out there for speed sessions and shoulder stuff, well, once or twice a month. And then there's another one just south of the city, which is almost fully remote, and we just go through an app for a lot of that stuff. So kind of three different models of kind of the way we try to facilitate everything. But I would say now, like, we've kind of become the go-to place for kind of shoulders and elbows. I think some of that is just based off of my experience, Leanne's experience. And as you know, it's kind of a nuanced little thing where it's not everybody coming out of PT school really knows the overhead athlete is probably as well as they should. So kind of just having people that have had some experience with that and whatnot. So we've kind of become the place to come for all that stuff. And then not a lot of people even in the province, I would even say, that are surgically able to do a Tommy John. So we've been able to kind of facilitate some of that stuff throughout the country to kind of get people. We actually use one of the Blue Jays docs for a lot of that stuff, all private stuff. But again, having seen it for a decade in person, it's kind of like, okay, I know what we kind of should be doing here. But again, still, even myself, still reaching out to old colleagues and talking to former players and stuff like that. So trying to keep myself in the loop when it comes to that stuff, because I know things have changed quite a bit as far as that stuff goes. So it's kind of a broad overview of kind of what we do.
Yeah, no, that's good. It's awesome. And I'm still affiliated with the one private gym here in town, and obviously we do that. It's probably not to the same scale, but we do a lot of that stuff. And we have a baseball coaching side of it where they do all the skill work, and then we would facilitate all the team training, things like that. So it's definitely something that is much needed, especially in West Virginia. High school strength and conditioning in West Virginia is almost non-existent unless you live in Morgantown. Like, it's not
right.
Like the very rural parts of the states. I mean, you might have to drive an hour just to get to like a Planet Fitness. So it's definitely something that is unfortunate for some of these high school kids. To kind of go back like a little bit further back in your career, I guess I didn't really have this on my list of questions, but it just made me think about it. Like, how did your like role as the kind of the rehab S&C coordinator, like, obviously that's a position that a lot of MLB teams have, organizations have, but like, what was it about? Like, was that something that you always kind of wanted to do, or that position just opened and you kind of just had the most experience and got it? Or what made you be the one that was kind of like the person that the Yankees felt that to bridge that gap between regular, like, you're 100% healthy S&C versus like, hey, you're coming back from some sort of injury? Like, what was
that kind of came about when Matt Krause came on, when he became director of strength and conditioning. Probably that was 2014, I think, somewhere around there. He came on, and that's when he brought Rigo along with him. And we kind of looked at that role, and Matt was like, okay, I want Rigo to kind of coordinate this whole thing, because I've kind of seen him somewhat in that role already. He basically just said, well, now you're rehab coordinator. I said, okay, that's what we're doing. So, but again, that's always been, it was a good match, as far as that's always been stuff I've enjoyed, as far as getting to, I mean, you kind of know this, being in the team sport setting, you don't really get a whole lot of one-on-one with guys. So I think that's kind of one of those roles where you can spend some more time with guys. You can actually work on stuff. You can see results. You can help a guy to learn how to run a little bit better, whether it's like from a hamstring strain or whatever it is. But I think you can feel like you've made an impact with a guy, and I think you can, or a girl, and I think you can kind of really build relationships that way, where you, at the end of the day, you're probably spending 2 hours a day, 6 days a week with these athletes, where sometimes, probably especially in the kind of NCAA setting, where it's like you only have an hour and you got 20 guys, like, you're not really going to get that kind of one-on-one, that kind of just interpersonal relationship, I would say. So I think that was something I always enjoyed when we did have some rehabs within the year, like at the teams. But I think that's just one thing that I've always really enjoyed. And there's still guys that I talk to that went through rehab with me that you just kind of develop a good relationship with, and you kind of you gel with, and you kind of develop. I don't want to say friendships, because that's not really what we're trying to push here, but I think just develop a trust, and I think develop a mutual respect for each other in that setting, which you don't always get.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And, that's something even again, as much as I said this before we even started the call, as much as I love being at Fairmont, like that's one of the, and I love making an impact on 415 student athletes, or whatever we have. It is something that you miss out a little bit. Like I even miss, when I was with the Rockies and I was traveling with the A-ball team and, you're around 32 guys or whatever it is, you kind of you get to know those 32 guys a lot more than what I get to know the 400 at Fairmont on a personal
Right.
level. And sometimes that's good and bad. Sometimes you learn more about them than you definitely ever needed to know.
That's for sure.
But it's one of those things where, I kind of miss that a little bit. And I think that's something that's awesome about being in professional sports is you definitely get, or even, at a D1 level where you're working with maybe only like the men's basketball team or the women, a women's soccer team or whatever it is, where you're kind of with your group of athletes. So I think it's definitely something that I miss, but at the end of the day, obviously I especially where I'm at with my age and all that, like I love being able to make as big of an impact on as many athletes as possible and kind of overseeing all that. But no, that's a really good point. Cause I remember definitely seeing, like when you guys were, I can remember back, the main team would come in and lift, or they'd come in after a game and lift, and you would have an injured guy or so in there, and getting to actually spend like literally just getting to walk around with him and almost do like you said, almost like a one-on-one personal training format for however long they were in Tampa for. So I really like the answer that you wrote on your notes here. So I definitely want to ask this. So what is kind of your, whether it's you personally and or what you guys do at Acumen, just kind of your overarching standards and principles in terms of like your S&C training and just the approach to how you guys do things?
Simplicity, honestly. It's I think, and you can probably speak on this as well, as far as the longer you do this job and the longer you're in this industry, kind of the more simplified things get for you. The sexy is good, but sexy always doesn't work. So as far as the way is, like, we have a practicum program here as well. So we usually get 2 students in I think about 3 or 4 times a year. So, and they'll be here for a couple months, and we kind of have our programming talk and all that other stuff. And it's just very, very simple. It's like kind of like I wrote down, just push, pull, hinge, squat. Spend a lot of time on one leg, because you think about it, those are the things that you need to do well. I would say that is one of the things that we've been, something I didn't get to do in pro sports, which is kind of, now that I've taken this role, we kind of got to address kids at a lot younger age now, where with the one group, I think we have a group that we go out and help out, and it's like 11U and 9U, right? Where it's, so you're kind of, are you doing the big strength and conditioning moves and stuff? Probably not, but if you can teach them how to hinge, you can teach them how to squat and lunge at that level. Well, if they stay in that program long enough, and then by the time they get to 15U, they're kind of getting into the gym a little bit more, and they kind of work their way through the program. It's night and day, the kids that have actually been taught that at the younger ages. And then talking to the coaching staff, it's like, okay, well, like these kids are moving a lot better than just kind of body awareness and movement patterns and stuff like that. So I think that's a big thing as far as the simplicity of it is. I mean, and you can get as complicated as you want as you get as your training age gets a little bit bigger. But I think that's the basis of our program, is definitely movement based, I would say. It's the other piece is that attention to detail, where being kind of a shoulder specific facility, we see a ton of baseball kids come in, softball girls come in, and it's not as if they've been given the wrong program by any means. I think the intentions are there from other practitioners and whatnot. But I think kind of what sets us apart, or kind of, and what I've learned in being in my experience, is just the attention to detail with just how you're doing exercises. Because you can give something as simple as just shoulder external rotation, and then you kind of ask the kid, well, where do you feel this? Well, I feel it in my delt. And like, okay, well, you're doing the right exercise, we're just not executing it correctly. So we'll kind of break it down probably 2 more steps. Where are your shoulder blades moving? How are you setting your scaps? Like the old down and back doesn't work all the time, all that type of stuff. So kind of teaching kids kind of how's your shoulder blade supposed to move? Because if that doesn't move correctly, you're not going to be executing all the stuff that's on this really great program that you were given the right way. So I think matter of getting athletes to feel things where they're supposed to feel them, I think that's the main goal, I would say. And I think especially moving into the private sector, where you may only see a kid once a month or once every 2 weeks for an hour, right? Like, what do you need to see in that hour to make sure that when they go home, they're executing everything the way they're supposed to, not just kind of banging their head against the wall, right? And I would say the other thing is I harp on my coaches all the time about this, is just you have to be able to answer why. Any part of the lift, any part of the workout. I think especially that was again another switch I had to make from going from pro sports where they didn't have a choice to be in the gym. They had to be there. It was a requirement of theirs. Most of them didn't want to be there. So you kind of had to fight that battle. But then when you get into the private sector where people are paying pretty good money to spend an hour with you, it's if they ask a question, you better be able to answer it, right? Where it's, why are we doing this exercise before this exercise, or the old, well, I saw this on Instagram, why aren't we doing this? Well, then you should be able to answer all those questions. And if you can't, then that exercise probably shouldn't be in your program, or you should be able to kind of go through the whole thing and say, we're doing speed work before strength work. We're doing all those and pretty basic, I would say, like strength and conditioning principles. But I think it's pretty easy to get caught up in getting online and kind of looking at what other people are doing. The problem is a lot of the times there's not a whole lot of context in that, right? Where it's like, okay, that looks like a good exercise. Well, great, it probably is. But I mean, I guess that's probably another piece that we'll talk about a little bit later. But as far as like your exercise library goes, there's nothing wrong with going on Instagram and looking and see what other people are doing, because it can give you ideas. But again, it's not just, I saw this, let's do it with my client tomorrow. That's like, it has to make sense. And there has to be a pretty healthy reasoning why that would be appropriate for that athlete or that client. So like, that's kind of the overview there, I would say.
No, I think it's perfect. And I think it's spot on. Again, I think it's something that's really important for my younger coaches and even myself to an extent to always keep in mind, like a couple of things that you said. Number one, to keep it simple, stupid. That's the thing so actually I'm actually hosting the West Virginia State Conference for the NSCA here in a couple of weeks. And I'm the first presenter. I'm the first presenter, and I'm presenting on in-season training, but one of my very first slides is like, just keep everything simple. Like what you're going to hear from me today is like, there's nothing groundbreaking. It's literally like, keep it simple. And I've kind of gotten to the conclusion now, like I'm definitely big on like the Dan John fundamental human movements, which you mentioned, but I almost think it's even simpler than that to an extent of the fact of like sprint, jump, throw shit. Like that's kind of the way that I like think about training.
Yeah.
Like, and that throwing shit might be Olympic list. It might be snatching. It might be throwing a barbell over your head. It might be throwing a barbell up to your shoulders on a clean. But I think that at the end of the day, that's really athletic development. And that's kind of what you were saying, especially, I talked to this about our interns at the private gym here in town. When we have interns there, I tell them all the time too, like, look, you guys what I'm doing with college athletes to me isn't even as valuable as what you're going to do with these 8, 10, 12, 14-year-old kids, because you're teaching them how to do something that they're going to hopefully be able to remember to do correctly for the rest of their life. You can teach them how to do a great squat at 8 to 10 years old. By the time I get them in college, if they're lucky to come play in college, they're going to be a better mover than what they were if they wouldn't have worked with you at the high school level. So
make your job easier.
Yeah. So I think that's super important. And then absolutely the questioning why thing, that's something that, I struggled with as a young coach. And I know that my assistants struggle with, they're just going to throw an exercise in there because they think it's a good idea, but it's like, yeah, but why is that there right now? Why is it, why didn't you do that first? Why didn't you do that last? Why didn't you do that last block? Like whatever it is, have a plan in place. And, you mentioned about like the working on your rotator cuff. As much as I like and appreciate all the, it's Driveline to me is kind of like what CrossFit did for adult fitness. Like CrossFit's great. Like there's good aspects of it, but it also made every 50-year-old think that they should be doing like butterfly pull-ups, right? And tearing their labrums is just part of the deal. And it's like, nah, it's not really the case. Driveline kind of did that to an extent for baseball. It did a great job of getting guys to do some sort of throwing prep and recovery work and activation and all that stuff, working on their mobility and honestly strength training. Like they're big on strength training. But I can't tell you how many times I see, whether it was in pro baseball or even now with our baseball guys, them doing their Jaeger bands and they're arching their back and doing all this. And it's like, is this supposed to be a thoracic extension exercise or a rotator cuff exercise? Because you're doing one, but not doing the other right now. So it's one of those things where I have that conversation, talk to a lot of our athletes of like, hey, let's take weight off of what you're doing right now. Let's do our, external rotations with no weight first so we can feel it in the right spot. And then let's add a 2.5 pound plate or a 5 pound plate or whatever. So let's not go grab the 10 pound dumbbells. And now we're working on our rhomboids and traps instead of working on our actual rotator cuff. So I think all that is awesome. And again, I think the more as a young coach, we can hear things like that of just look, like people that have been in this for 10 to 15 years now, they're telling their athletes, like, do less better. That's what we need to be telling them right now. Like,
yeah, like you kind of going back to like the rotator cuff stuff. Like I had to specifically find 1/4 inch bands just for shoulder stuff
yep,
because, and that's kind of the rule in our gym is like if you're doing shoulder work, you're using a 1/4 inch band, right? It's
yep,
a 1/2 inch band is probably too much because by the time the third rep comes along and your shoulders are touching your earlobes, we're not working on what we need to be working on, right? So I think just a lot of that is like you're right is trying to convince kids that basically at that time is like more is not better in the sense of more weight is not always better for these type of exercises. And then I think you kind of go back, you have to relate it back to their sport. I think that's probably the bigger piece of it, because if you just say, use a lighter band, they're going to be like, okay, well, I'm not strong enough for this one. It's like, no, that's not what it is. It's okay. We need to be able to activate this because when we go through our pitching motion, you need to be able to do this. And so I think being able to break that down to some degree, not only helps you explain what you're trying to say, but I think it builds a little bit more buy-in with your athletes as well. It's like, okay, this guy actually kind of knows what he's talking about, or at least he can fake it a little bit. So
yeah, no, absolutely. It's definitely a huge aspect of, and that's the tough part sometimes when you're working in like the collegiate setting. Like we have sports that, like we have an acrobatics and tumbling sport that it's basically a competitive cheer / gymnastics. Like I've never done either one of those sports, but I can sit and watch the sport, and literally when these girls are throwing girls over their head, it's basically a jerk. Like, so I
right.
can relay to them like, hey, like when we're doing these jerks, these split jerks and these push jerks, like of all of our sports on campus, yours probably translates the most to doing some of these Olympic lifts. Like, so it's one of those things you can definitely get buy-in from that for sure. Men's basketball maybe a little different. Those guys don't love to do any of those things. They don't see a transfer in any of those. But I definitely want to get into some of the different sports that you guys work with. But I do want to stay kind of on the baseball side of things here for a second. And this is, I know Tyler would probably have this question, being on the baseball team, and we're obviously catching and working with our pitchers a lot and doing a lot of stuff with our pitchers. What are kind of, especially talking to like the orthopedic surgeons? Obviously, I know like if you read all the stuff that Fleissig put out all those years back down at the whatever that place is in Alabama they have. There's a lot of things that go into throwing injuries, whether it's baseball or softball or other sports that are overhead kind of throwing athletes. What are kind of some of the commonalities that you guys see in terms of whether it's rotator cuff injuries, UCLs, just throwing injuries in general? I mean, from the time that you were with the Yankees to Acumen, like what do you feel like would be like, I know you have a son, like what would be some things that you would maybe try to do to help save your son from having some sort of upper extremity injury from playing sports like baseball or water polo, even for that matter?
I think general strength is probably the first one. Is you can kind of almost go back to kind of what you kind of touched on with the driveline stuff. Is like there's nothing wrong with it. I'll say that right now. I think it's a good program, but it's not for everybody. And I think what we've seen here at least is that kind of gets blanketed across entire academies at times, where it's okay, now everybody's doing weighted balls, and you got 13, 14-year-old kids throwing weighted balls when they can't do a push-up, or they can't do a pull-up, or they can't do certain things, where I think there should be some type of prerequisite strength before adding a load to something like that. I think you need to throw a lot to gain strength and learn how to do that movement from a technical mechanical standpoint. But I think prerequisite strength for kind of those higher level type things is definitely something that we don't see enough, I would say. And then I think the other piece to it, which we don't really have a handle on, which we're trying to work a little bit better at it, it's one of those tough things, is how much time off are these kids taking? What's their ramp up throwing look like? Right. Like, I think the issue is kind of ramping up everybody at the same rate. Not everybody's done the same stuff coming into that point. Right. And it's not really any different than pro ball, because where do you see the most amount of injuries? Well, March and April, right? Where maybe guys weren't quite prepared for what was coming to them in spring training. Maybe things changed and they were supposed to be prepared for 2 innings, and all of a sudden they're throwing 5, right? So kind of how that sometimes works. But I think it's load management is probably a big one. And then I kind of back to the first point is I think just getting kids stronger and more stable. I mean, just and again, it probably goes back even further to what we were talking about is just implementing movement patterns and strength and all those things really early, just for kids to be able to take on the load that's going to be put on them regardless, right? Especially if you start to get to any high level sport, really doesn't matter. The volume of that's going to go up so high, it's going to be really tough to kind of match that from a physicality standpoint. I mean, and being obviously up in Canada, we see that a ton with hockey, right? Like these kids are on the ice so way too much. Like we have 3 or 4 pro guys that we have in the off season that we train, and they aren't getting on the ice as much as these kids are. It's not even close. So it goes from they start with regular hockey season, which we're kind of we're in that right now for in season. Then there's spring 3-on-3 hockey, there's summer hockey, so basically these kids are skating 12 months of the year now and not really getting a break. So, and it's not, I wouldn't say it's very much from the lower body standpoint, because you'll see these kids that come in that are even 16, 17, 18, and their asses are huge and their quads are massive, but their upper body's just frail, right? And I think some of that is they're spending so much time on the ice and not enough time in the weight room, just being able to take the load of the impacts and whatnot. So we do see quite a few shoulders, I would say, from like the athletic surgery standpoint. So tons of dislocations, a lot of ladder J's, a lot of bank hearts, stuff like that, and you can just tell when kids come in, like their thighs are massive and their upper body looks like they've never been in the gym, but they're supposed to be being able to take contact, and they can't, right? So almost kind of going along the same lines as baseball is just being physically prepared. I don't think it really matters the sport, right? You kind of have to check all your boxes to be able to do that sport and make all your joints robust enough and have enough stability to do it, right? So I think I don't think it matters the sport what it is, but I think it's especially as you kind of go through this whole thing, is the volume of the sport's going to go up. So how can you do that? What can you do to kind of combat that physically as a young athlete, I guess?
Yeah. Well, and it's one of those things too, going back to, we were talking about making an impact with those middle school and high school age kids. Are you guys seeing in Canada, I'm sure you are, like the same level of like early specialization? I mean, you kind of mentioned that with the hockey kids. Obviously, that's happening with baseball and basketball. And it's same with basketball. You got kids playing basketball, I mean, literally year round now, instead of going through a season. Hey, I'm going to play football or soccer in the fall, and then basketball or wrestling or hockey in the winter, and then in baseball in the spring and summer. Like it's the same sport like month after month, like year after year. And they're doing it when they're 10. Like everybody wants to be the best 10-year-old baseball player, which is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And I think that's a big factor. And then I really point a lot of it too I mean, number one, just our eating and sleeping and habits for our kids are terrible and they're all overweight.
Right.
But it's also the idea of like they just don't do enough other physical activity. So even if you're going to play baseball year round, like if you're not out climbing trees, if you're not out like doing the monkey bars and doing stuff like that, and knowing how to roll down a hill and do some basic little gymnastic tumbling things, like I think that's a huge aspect of kids just aren't they're just not as well rounded, which is again kind of what you're saying, and that's something that we even started doing with our football guys when I took over at Fairmont. Like we had to teach guys how to do front rolls. It's like, dude, your sport is falling on the ground. Like if you don't know how to fall on the ground, like how are you gonna, like when you get tackled by a 300-pound defensive lineman and he falls on top of you, hopefully you know how to fall on the ground. Like so that's like little stuff like that I think is, and our guys like it. Our guys like doing the tumbling, and we play around with cartwheels. Nothing's funner than watching our 350-pound offensive lineman try to do cartwheels. Like, but again, I like it, and a lot of our guys, seem to enjoy it. So, I mean, is that something that you guys are obviously dealing with in Canada too? It's just the general lack of
exactly the same. Yeah, it's exactly the same, and it's funny because being in the private sector, like obviously you got to make money, but I mean, I'll get parents to come in and they're like, okay, how many days a week do you want to see my kid in the off season? I'm like, ideally he's playing another sport, and I don't see you as much as you want to say, yeah, I'd like to see you 4 times a week for an off season program.
Right.
Like your kid's 14. Like if you could go play basketball or go play volleyball or do something like that, then I don't have to worry about plyometrics at all. You're going to get that stuff taken care of on your own. Then obviously once it gets kind of closer to season and whatnot, we can kind of ramp it up and get a little bit more specific with some stuff like that. But I would much rather, kind of like you said, have kids go play multiple sports than specialize in baseball at 13, 14 years old. I mean, I try to always kind of revert back to you kind of try to give your best examples, but you got, I mean, Kyler Murray was drafted in the first round in baseball and in football, right? Well, he doesn't do that unless he played both of those sports all the way through college, right? I think Judge was supposed to go somewhere else and play basketball and football. Stanton was kind of in the same situation. Like, the guys are good athletes because they can do a bunch of stuff, not because they were really, really good at one thing. Now, obviously, they've all made probably the best decisions for their lives, but they had the option at a high school to do multiple things because they did multiple things, right? You're kind of putting all your peas in one pod from what you want to do with the rest of your life standpoint, but also athletically, like, you have to be able to do other stuff, right? And I think looking at the kind of long-term athletic development models, like, if we can get kids to do more sports, which is just pretty much counterintuitive of what everything is, the way everything is going right now. So it's a little bit, we're kind of banging our heads against the wall, but I think what you guys are doing is really smart. Is, okay, they haven't had this stuff. How can we start to implement this stuff at these higher levels without blowing anybody out? And just and like you said, it's fun, right? Like, it's out of the normal, it's out of the ordinary of your normal gym stuff, strength and conditioning stuff, and they feel like, oh, we're just having fun today. Well, you've actually probably got a lot better doing this stuff than what we would have done in the gym today. So I think that's a really good approach.
No, again, it's almost sad. And it's something like, obviously, I know you have kids, and my wife and I have a 9-month-old, so it's still a couple years away from that. But that to me is like, I don't even know if I want to put her in any organized like team sports till she's like 8, 10, 11 years old, because it's like, she's either going to be coming to work with me and doing, like, seeing how teams train and doing stuff like that, or we're going to just throw in this, like, something, just gymnastics just for fun, or just taking her to the playground and doing monkey bars. Like, you want to talk about rotator cuff health and shoulder health, like, playing on the monkey bars is probably the best thing that you could be doing for that kind of stuff. And so it's one of those things where it's kind of sad that we've gotten to this point where our kids are really good at baseball, but kind of suck as a human being. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like, that's
just they're not very good movers, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, same thing with our kids. Like, anything they ask to do, we'll say yes, right? And we've kind of asked, and I've kind of been fortunate. Neither kid has said I want to play hockey yet, so we're good. But yeah, like, with both of our young kids, there's a program here, Sport Ball, I think it's called, where basically once a week you do a different sport, and it's just awesome. in a gym, and they play basketball, lacrosse, volleyball, and they just kind of get to play a little bit of everything. And I think we do that for a few years, and I think eventually you'll start to be like, hey, I really like to do this one or this one or these two. So kind of gives them a broad spectrum of, this is the stuff you can do, not being forced into being like, well, you're in Canada, so you're playing hockey, right?
Right. All right. Well, let's definitely get into the rodeo on the bull riding, because I don't know of anybody else. I think as far as unique things go, my one former GA, when he was at Baylor, he helped with, they have equestrian. So that's the closest thing that I would know of this. And then the other kind of out there strength conditioning job is when I was at P3, they had a contract with Joe Gibbs Racing, and they would bring the pit crew guys down and do like a combine prep stuff with them. But definitely rodeo is definitely one of those out there sports that those dudes are badasses. I mean, I would put them right up there with like MMA fighters in terms of just being a little mentally twisted if you want to hop on a 1,000-pound, 2,000-pound bull, whatever it is. But what does that kind of look like? I mean, was that something you had any experience in prior to, or when you got they started sending you rodeo riders and stuff?
So
what does that look like?
That kind of happens somewhat organically, again, through Leanne Gullett. When she was in Winnipeg working, she started working with a girl there that was a figure skater, actually, and she was actually Olympic level pairs figure skater. And then her husband was a bareback rider, and he'd been kind of getting in the gym and whatnot, and kind of dabbled in a few things. And then basically she said, well, Leanne said, well, I'll program for you because she had really good strength conditioning background. So she started programming for him and kind of built that way, where I think she got up to about 4 or 5 guys that she was programming for. And then when she came to Edmonton and kind of brought some of that along with her, and then I came on board, and she's like, again, kind of got to the point where she didn't have time to do everything. So she started to pass some stuff off, and that started to kind of build that way as far as getting some guys there. And then we kind of had the idea through the Canadian Pro Rodeo Sports Medicine team to kind of have a combine event type thing, where nice thing about this population is most of them have never really been in the gym at all. So you're not having to break any bad habits. You're just it's not a whole lot different than grabbing an 11-year-old kid and teaching him how to hinge and squat. But these kids are 17 to 25, 26, right? Where they're strong as shit, because most of them come from a farming, ranching background, a lot of like blue collar type stuff, where they've been doing stuff their whole life, just not necessarily with the best form, right? So we offered that camp, and that's kind of been something that we've done probably about 4 or 5 years, maybe not long, 4 years now, I would say. So we talked about it and kind of based it loosely on kind of what like a spring training would be, kind of like that first few days where you come in, you get on the table, get an assessment, right? We'll do concussion assessments, we'll do hip, shoulders, all that type of stuff. But then kind of get into the performance side as well. So we tried to do as much stuff that was validated as possible. So easy stuff like your 5-10-5 vertical jumps and stuff like that. And then we try to get a little more specific with, okay, what do rodeo guys need? So obviously a ton of groin work, adductors, core stability, kind of all that type of stuff. So we kind of built out a little bit of a testing protocol for that, and kind of ran with that for 3 or 4 years. And then actually we ended up having one of our former employees was a PhD, so he kind of helped along those lines as far as being the really smart guy in the room. And we had a paper published probably about 3 years ago now that's in the NACA Journal of Strength and Conditioning, just anthropometrics of rodeo athletes. So basically, what does a bull rider look like physically? Like, what is a bareback? What is saddle bronc? All those type of kind of more of the rough stock events, I would say. What do they look like physically, right? What's their grip strength? So that kind of opened the doors a little bit as far as like, if you're going to train this population, what should we really be working on, right? So what are these guys that are doing it at the professional level, making money at this? What do they look like? What are they good at? So that's kind of because we kind of went down a deeper rabbit hole as far as what is there out there for research, and there wasn't anything on the performance side. There was a decent amount on like concussions and stuff like that, which for obvious reasons, I think. But yeah, so we kind of have built that up pretty well now. As far as like what do we normally see, it's kind of hockey, kind of football mix, I would say. Lots of groins, lots of shoulders, some knees mixed in. But what's funny about this population is like before you get them in, you'll look at their health and history, and that shit's 4 pages long, right? Yeah. I have one bareback rider that comes in pretty often. He was actually the Canadian finals bareback champion this past year. But it's torn adductor, torn rectus abdominis surgery. He's had a torn pec. He's broken both wrists. He's a bunch of pelvic floor issues, had concussions. Like when you start reading like the whole thing, it's like, what bone hasn't been broken yet? Well, where haven't you had surgery? So yeah, they're a really, really fun population to work with, and they're difficult in the sense of, I know we're kind of going to get into some of the in-season versus off-season training type stuff, and it's one of those sports that they're really never not in season. So a periodized plan is almost out the window, right? Like kind of, honestly, it's very similar to in-season baseball, where basically you're playing every day. You're depending on your training background, you might be able to get a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger in season, but the travel schedule is so shit that again, you talk about like the sleeping and the recovery piece to it. That almost becomes as important as the lifting and whatnot. It's those conversations are long.
Yeah. No, I mean, and again, it's pretty awesome. I found the article, so I'll make sure I definitely, I love reading anything like that. So I'll read the article. I noticed that you mentioned like the concussions and there's some neck flexion force and stuff like that. So I'll have a question about that here in a second. But it's again, it's kind of funny, not funny. It's one of those, like, I don't even know what ironic or whatever, because like I feel like sports like wrestling, obviously MMA fighters and even gymnasts to an extent, where like their sport is there's a strengthening component to their sport. Like, and like if you play football, you don't get your grip strength doesn't go up from playing football, where you're like your strength of your low back or your abs doesn't go up because you play football. But if you wrestle, like you get stronger like by wrestling. If you do gymnastics, you get stronger through doing like the gymnastics training itself. Like it's one of those where I feel like rodeo would be very similar to that, to where like those guys, like you said, they're already blue collar strong. I mean, as a former wrestler, like those were the scariest guys to go against, in my opinion, when I wrestled. It was like the guys that you knew grew up in the country, and like they might have never been on a bench press before, and they didn't look like they were like long and lanky, but those are the guys that you knew if they got to control your wrist, you weren't getting your hand back. Like they're just different type of strength. Gristle, they're just beta gristle. But it's kind of one of those things where like you said, like their sport, they might come in and do some squats and pull-ups and stuff with you in the weight room and do some, trunk stability. And then they're going to go out and do their sport, and their sport is going to like just beat them to pieces just to get better at their sport. So it's definitely a crazy thing. I've never been to a rodeo. I've watched it on TV. I feel like it's like hockey to me. Like I never specifically try to go watch hockey like on TV or even like in a, like go to the Penguins game or anything like that. But it's like when it's on and I watch it, I'm like, why do I not watch this more? Like it's awesome.
I think it's one of those things where once you go in person, you kind of, there's that big aha moment. I think that's a lot with hockey too. Like people are kind of watching on TV, oh, it's kind of boring. Then you get them in the arena and actually watching, and especially if you get a little bit closer, you're like, oh, how does this even work? Right.
Yeah, we went to
you kind of get that I get it point where it's now, then it's a lot of it makes a lot more sense.
We went to when I was down in Tampa and I was working at Kinetic Pro while I was with you guys, like in the off season, I'd be working there. One of the pitchers we had, their parents had season tickets and they like never went. So he gave me a couple tickets to the Lightning game. And that my wife, actually, I mean, we went to 50 WVU football games, D1 football games, great crowd, great, environment. And we went to the first Lightning game, and she was like, this is the most exciting sporting event I've ever been to. I'm like, I completely agree. I was like, why are we not? But again, I still don't watch hockey on TV very often, but it's an awesome sport. And I'm sure rodeo would be very similar. So in terms of, obviously with you being, going back again to like the Yankees, the rehab coordinator, and then with your role now, like I guess, how often are you, the reason I want to ask this is, like, obviously we work with our athletic trainers at Fairmont, and I don't really get to ever talk to the surgeons or anything like that, obviously, but sometimes our athletes will go outside of like our university network, and they'll have to have surgery and do surgery at home, and then their PT will send me with what they're allowed to do. How much of that are you going off of, like, just experience, or are you like, if an athlete gets to a point and you're like, hey, we're not allowed to do the next thing? And I'm not trying to say you like overstep what their physical therapist or athlete trainer tell them to do, but how much of it is of that rehab process is kind of feel and experience? How much of it is like you're sticking to the book and exactly what the physical therapist and the athletic trainer said? How much of it is they're giving you leeway to say, hey, this athlete, it might be a guy that, like a rodeo guy or a hockey guy, that they're in the gym all the time and they're progressing all the time, so they want to do more and want to push more, versus somebody that, maybe like a middle school soccer player or something that is already timid at the gym anyway, let alone after having a surgery or something like that. Like how much, what does that conversation and that kind of relationship need to look like? And kind of how do you write your programs based off what they're allowed to do versus what the athlete looks like they're allowed to do? Like how much of that is being factored in?
I think this is a unique situation here because our surgeons are in-house. They don't do the surgeries here. There's private surgical facilities where they do all that type of stuff, but they're in-house doing consultations and stuff like that about every 2 weeks, give or take. So literally I can go talk to the surgeon that did the surgery on this girl's knee, right? And I can say, hey, Curtis, what do you think about this? Like this kind of popped up. Can you come take a look? Where I don't know of another place where you have that. where you actually have the person who did the surgery be like, oh no, you're fine. Like usually that usually entails a lot of phone calls and a lot of appointments, and it's usually about 15 minutes of, okay, no, you're fine. So it's definitely, it's a unique situation where so even the way we've had to kind of set up the gym and the weight room and the training room here, we have our training room on one side with we got 3 beds there and a couple of rooms, but then we have 2 big garage doors that we leave up pretty much all the time that walks directly into the weight room. So the amount of time that spends going back and forth constantly is something that we honestly probably didn't have in pro ball. Probably I'd like to see more of it, as far as that approach of your constant communication between you and your ATs, which I know is not always the easiest thing, right? Sometimes ATs kind of have a somewhat of a bad rap at times for being a little softer, if you will, as far as what you're able to do and what you're allowed to do. So I think who you're working with definitely dictates that, but I think we're lucky here, at least in our situation, where Leanne has a very good strength and conditioning background. We have 2 other ATs that spent 15 years at Cirque du Soleil. So really, really good backgrounds and that type of stuff, but kind of they all had the same type of approach of like, we all need to be doing the same type of stuff here. And so the nice thing is, if anything pops up where I say I have one of my ACL girls in the morning and say, oh, she's a little stiff in her knee today and whatnot. Basically, I just check the schedule, and if there's somebody's available, I say, hey, can you come just work on her for 15 minutes? Yep, boom, a little bit of whatever, Graston coupling, whatever it is. Like, we're very, very, very little on the modality side, I would say. Like we just got an ice machine the other day but it wasn't even for what we needed here. But we don't have really anything. It's all movement based. It's all exercise based stuff. But I think having that approach back and forth and that constant communication, it helps our side as far as, hey, this looks good today. Do you think this is a good idea? And it's literally a 15-step walk to be like, hey, does this look okay to you? Like, oh yeah, you're good, or no, maybe not quite yet. And then kind of the other piece to it, and kind of more my side of it, everything that we try and do here from the rehab and reconditioning side is criteria based, right? So it's like, if you can do A, we can move you on to B, right? So maybe if somebody may not be available at that time and everything kind of looks really good that day, and they're obviously in the right spot from the rehab process, it's like, hey, let's check this out, see where it's at. Okay, you can do that, and so we can now move on to the kind of the next thing, right? Or rather than kind of, and I think this is where a lot of probably young coaches and probably a lot of young PTs kind of run into, is you get the rehab, the protocol, right? And they're just focused in on the protocol. No, you're at 12 weeks, so you should be able to do this now. Well, that's not always the case, right? So I know from experience, we'll get a lot of later stage ACLs that go to kind of like the same situation, kind of where you have, where they may go somewhere else for surgery and they may go somewhere else for their rehab, but they kind of get to that like 6-month mark where everything really starts to pick up, where it's like, hey, now I'm going to be running, I'm going to be trying to changing direction and whatnot. And it's like, okay, now my knee hurts. And it's like, okay, well, have you done A, B, C, D? And a lot of them, it's like, oh, no. It's like, okay, so now we kind of got to backtrack a little bit and be like, okay, let's cover all these bases to make sure that everything is prepared for what we're going to be asking you to do. And knock on wood, 9 times out of 10, once we kind of go back and kind of cover all those bases and then reintroduce the running or the change of direction, whatever it is, it's okay, my knee feels good now. So it's not always the perfect situation, because again, you don't always have people under your care all the time. But I think having the ability to consult with the surgeon and consult with ATs ATs with similar mindsets is probably the biggest thing. That is a really, really big plus here comparative to even some other situations I've been in early in my career.
Yeah, I think that, and again, I think that's something too, like even going back to like the strength coach idea. And again, this is not trying to take any jabs at athletic trainers, because honestly, the ones that I've been around for the most part have always been really good. But it's like, sometimes I don't know if there's always like the why is being answered on some of the modalities that they're using and things that they're using. And, right. I question that sometimes. Like, you got an athlete with a sprained ankle and they're 2 weeks out and they're still putting ice on it. And it's like, don't we know that the guy that came out with the rice thing redacted all of his stuff about putting ice? Like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
But the one thing that is obviously it's great for you guys to be in that situation where literally the surgeon's right there, the physical therapist, the athletic trainer, they're all right there in house. You can like talk to them. The athlete can literally go, and they don't have to try to schedule an appointment 6 months later for a follow up.
Right.
They can literally just say, "Hey, this is bothering me today. What's your input?" I think that's really a great situation. And I think the biggest thing, and I kind of I was reading this for like some information on this for a while, and I kind of got off of it, but there's a huge neurological aspect to like the rehab from a like nervous system like stimulus standpoint and from the actual psychological side too. And I know two examples we had at Fairmont. We had a men's basketball player that had unhappy triad, ACL, MCL, meniscus tear, and then we had a female soccer player that had I think it was ACL and just a small meniscus tear. The men's basketball player, and he was a gym rat. I mean, he would lift with me. He'd go with our athletic trainer, and then he would go to a gym off campus in the evenings and literally just do like arm farm and upper body and just. I mean, he was just an absolute animal. He tore his ACL, had surgery. He came back the next year and started 7 months after surgery and played every game. Started every game for us that year, like 7 months. Most people aren't even like ready to start running and cutting at 7 months necessarily from ACL. He came back and played the whole season. Versus there was a girl on the soccer team that she ended up actually having to medically retire. She came back, and whether and some of it, you don't know, maybe it was the surgery, maybe it was the initial couple months of physical therapy. But she was a year went by this past fall, and she still couldn't sprint like without having a hitch in her step. She couldn't jump. She couldn't squat parallel. Like it was one of those things where I feel really bad for her because it essentially ruined her, like ended her career. But it makes you wonder, is it the surgery? Is it the PT? Is it the strength training program? Or what other underlying like neurological thing are we missing? Like what else is going on there? And I'm sure somebody has an answer out there. I don't have the answer. I'm sure somebody does. But it's definitely something to think about of like not every ACL reconstruction is going to be the same cookie cutter timeline. Like
no. I think that's why we've kind of tried to put together somewhat of like an ACL continuum rather than a protocol where there's suggested time frames on things, but everything is kind of just sped up to early stage, couple stages of mid, about 3 stages of late, and then that return to sports stage. I mean, it's essentially about 6 months long, but then I think even to your point of like, there's one thing to getting back to your sport, then there's another thing to getting back to your sport at the level you were at before, right? And I think that the numbers on that stuff are not very good. I think if you kind of look at the research as far as that stuff goes, the percentages are not great. But that's one of those things where I don't think you can put a time frame on it. I think personally, I think the criteria based is the way to go, because again, I think that's where you get those situations of your dude that came back in 7 months. Well, he obviously passed all the tests that he needs to pass, which 7 months is still really fast. Don't get me wrong. But there's other people that their rehab is not a linear process. I will say there's going to be peaks, there's going to be valleys, there's going to be plateaus. Like, what do you kind of have to do to remedy some of those things? And then that's where, to some degree, I think that's maybe where technology comes in a little bit, where if you can actually get on force plates and whatnot and kind of see just a little deeper dive into what's going on, because I think the last thing anybody wants is a re-tear, right? And pushing somebody back a little bit too quickly because they passed their 3-hop test, which again, that's probably another whole podcast on that. Right. But I think just having that type of stuff. And I think if you go back to kind of what you said about like the psychological aspect of it, having benchmarks for people as they go through is like, no, you've done really well. But I think having benchmarks to see this is where you're at. It doesn't matter where I should be, but this is where you're at. This is where we need to get you to go. But if you can give them some type of objective measure for that, I think mentally, I think that helps people, right? So I think there's things that have to be done, but I think having kind of benchmarks and goals and checkpoints and stuff like that definitely seems to help quite a bit. And then again, having a full team of people helping you, whether it's the surgeon, the AT, or the SNC.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you guys have any like tech that you guys are using there? Do you guys have force plates or?
So we have the Hawken Dynamics force plates. Again, just like anything, I learned this from Matt Krause, kind of walking around, walk around the PBS CCS vendor show, or even if you go to like the NSA coaches conference or something like that, and you talk to, there's thousands pretty much of places that are trying to sell you stuff.
Right.
And his biggest thing was, does this make my day shorter? And nobody's been able to say yes yet, right?
Right.
If anything, tech's going to add time to your day, right?
Yeah.
Because then, yeah, okay, everybody's, it's great to get numbers, but then, okay, now you've got to break down those numbers. And then, so I think there's a time and a place for it. And I definitely think that there's some places that go way too deep into that side where that's all they're worried about. Like you see coaches now that they're walking around with an iPad and they're not even coaching anymore, right? They're more worried about like, oh, what was your jump at today? Or what's your fatigue index? What's your RSI, sorry. It's okay. There's definitely a piece to it to try and get ahead of some stuff, but I don't think you can solely rely on that. So like we kind of tell that to a lot of our young strength coaches, and they kind of have a lot of the same questions because they want to get into the tech, into the force plates, into the VBT, whatever it is. It's just get good at a couple little things first, right? Like if you're going to even something as simple as a counter movement jump, like you look at the data on a counter movement jump and there's 200 different metrics you can look at and you're going, holy shit, I didn't even know half. I'm just a dumb strength coach. Like that's above my head. But I think if you can kind of hone down on 3 or 4 different metrics and be like, hey, this is what we're gonna follow because it makes sense in their sport. Like baseball being a very concentric based sport, maybe that's like we look at concentric impulse, right? We look at stuff like that. That's all we're really going to focus on, because you go down a rabbit hole there, you're just going to get a headache, right? So we're not a ton into technology. I think we use the force plates more for the kind of the checkpoints for return to play, like for our ACLs and our shoulders and whatnot, because we'll test them 3, 6, 9, 12 months. So just to kind of get your checkpoints, make sure you're at where you're at, and kind of go from there. But to have objective measures, not only for the athletes, but then kind of to let on the private surgery side, let the surgeons know, like, hey, this is going well, like the outcomes are what we want. And so maybe if we track this long enough and say, okay, we can actually say that over the last 5 years, we've seen that most athletes can return at 12 months or 10 months, whatever it is. And we have kind of a side piece to it. We have a huge total joint business within the business, right? It's just another thing that's out of necessity, where people are waiting years for knee and hip replacements. Well, if we can kind of say, hey, yeah, you're going to be pretty much good as gold in about 4 months because we've done testing on it, which that, again, there's no real research out there for that either. But it kind of helps on our side for the surgeons for their next consult, because, hey, no, we've seen for the most part, if you have this hip surgery in 4 months, you're going to be good. So there's ways to use it. I think there's ways to get really lost in it too.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And I know actually next week, we're going to be doing a coaching call with one of the former guys. He was actually the double A and triple A strength coach when I was with the Rockies. And obviously I think, people want to kind of, and I had some not issues with Sparta, but Sparta kind of would leave me asking more questions sometimes than what they would provide answers. But I think the thing that Sparta had at least back then had going for them was, like you said, they kept it simple. You looked at 3 metrics, and they kind of even made up their own terms for those 3 metrics. Like they called it load, explode, and drive, which wasn't the actual like technical physics terms for them, but they made life easier to an extent. And it kind of put us on a decision tree. Like, hey, if this is what's low for you, then these are the exercises that you're going to go do. And it allowed us to kind of bracket guys into certain groups and put them down there. And again, whether I completely always agree with them or not, it did kind of, to an extent, do it. What Krause was saying was it did kind of make our lives a little bit easier. We didn't have to sit there and write an individualized training program for 300 athletes. We were able to, have our guys in
it kind of goes back groups. To some of that. Yeah. It goes back to some of that almost like Mike Boyle stuff, where you just bucket athletes, right?
Yep.
His was obviously a lot more bucketed on like movement pattern type stuff, but you can use the technology the same way. If you do a counter movement jump and a squat jump, well, you're going to be able to tell which kids need to work on strength and which ones need to work on plyometrics pretty quick, and then you can kind of go 2 different directions there and simplify things, especially if you're dealing with a shit ton of athletes as well.
Yeah. And that's what we don't have those at Fairmont, but we just use the regular jump mat. We just look at jump mat and we kind of track it throughout the year and see if our athletes are getting better over their 3-4 year career, and everything like that. But the one thing that sold me on Sparta back when I was with the Rockies, and we interviewed the Trevor. I don't know if you know Trevor. He's the coordinator for the Rockies minor league. He's been there for probably 6-7 years now, but we interviewed him last year. And one of the things I think I told him too was when we were doing all the lessons on Sparta and they were kind of telling us about the different groups that we'd be in, when they were saying like, hey, do you typically have these kinds of injuries, like muscle strains? Did you play shortstop and center field and wide receiver? And I was like, wait, that was me. Wait, that was me. Wait. And then it was like, here's what exercises you probably need to do more of. And they were the ones I never did. I was like, oh, okay, well, that actually makes a lot of sense. Like it kind of sold me on it because like it bucketed me into something. And I was like, oh shit, like they're talking about me right now. Like I fit that bucket. So it was definitely kind of got me a little bit more buy-in. I know we're getting kind of close for time, but I definitely want to, if you're good, I got like 2 or 3 more questions. So the one that I don't really get to ask a whole lot, but because of what the note you put next to it, I definitely want to ask it is what makes, especially being in working in the minors and seeing the big league guys during spring training and kind of working with those guys in a rehab setting a lot. What is something that do you think is the most important thing for making certain athletes be successful, whether it's kids that shouldn't have gotten a college scholarship, but did, kids that shouldn't have got drafted, but did, people like who I think you're going to talk about, that maybe were undervalued, but then ended up having one of the best careers in baseball of all time.
Yeah, I think it's the consistency, right? I think if you do anything often enough, you're going to get better at it. And then it's consistency, not only in like the physical side. Can you close the door? It's the physical side obviously is one thing, getting into the gym and doing all those type of things, but then being mentally consistent as well. And I think baseball, like, and honestly, I can relate this back to rodeo as well, because we had a meeting with one of our bull riders and kind of his year end, kind of year start meeting, and kind of be like, hey, what are your goals and whatnot? And buck off rate's 50%. So if you're riding 50% of the bulls you get on, you're having a really, really good year. So I can kind of relate that back to baseball, where 3 out of 10's really good, especially now. It's getting a lot better. But yeah, so like being the same guy every day, whether you go 0 for 3, 3 for 3. But that's kind of touching on that story is in spring training. And I didn't get to see a ton in season, obviously, but even in spring training, having Jeter around, where if the game was at 1, you could find him whatever time it was, eating the same thing, drinking the same thing. It was peanut butter and jelly and a Red Bull. It was just the consistency day after day after day of showing up at the same time. And I think, yes, in baseball, that's really important, but I think in any role, in any sport, and I think in just a job force, that makes big difference. I mean, I'll put our old clubby in the same conversation as Derek Jeter, but he was a really, really good clubby. I had an A ball, probably the best one we had, because you knew if I left the dugout and went up into the locker room in the 4th inning, he was going to be vacuuming. If I went into the 6th inning, he was putting the close in. Like it was so regimented that way that everything was done, everything was on time, and he was the same person every day, and everything got done, right? So I don't think it really matters whether you're a professional athlete or the guy that's washing the clothes. It's kind of the same approach, and that you got to be the same person, but you also have to just know that you have to execute the same every single day, no matter of ups, downs, and all those type of things.
Yeah, it's fun. First of all, I'd like to be able to hear from Jeter to hear how the peanut butter and jelly and Red Bull. Like, I feel like that's something that he probably had to start doing in like high school or something, and he just ended up sticking with it forever. Yeah. Then I don't know. I feel that sounds like a high school baseball player pregame meal.
Yeah, you have everything at your disposal, and you're having
not a
peanut butter and jelly.
20-year big league vet, Hall of Famer. But I think the biggest thing with that too that I take away is, and this is obviously something that you hear a ton at the college level from sport coaches, is the mental toughness thing. And I think one thing people overlook when it comes to mental toughness is it's embracing the redundancy of doing the same shit every day. Like that is what mental toughness is. I mean, that it's not let's go out in the cold and do bear crawls in the cold and freeze our dicks off. Like that's not mental toughness. Like some guys on the team that already are mental tough, they're gonna do it regardless, and everybody else is gonna bitch about it. Are those guys, which guys on the team are going to show up and want to do it again tomorrow just because they want to be the consistent guys like that. That's what it is. It's kind of that daily discipline, and that's something that I think gets overlooked, of just the fact that like, it's not just about doing hard stuff. It's embracing hard stuff, but realizing that it's going to always be like that. Like you're always going to have to go in show up
Yeah.
4 hours early before the game, eat your peanut butter and Red Bull, get in the cage, take ground balls, like come back out, do it again an hour later before they, it's just like doing that same shit. And, like I said, my GA is not on here. He's actually probably catching and hitting right now. But, one thing I'll tell him is like the guy that I saw the most from, really two guys, is Arenado and Trevor Story when I was with the Rockies. Like, again, I didn't get to work with them a lot, but those guys were in there all the time. Charlie Blackmon would come in every day at 6 a.m. and roll out, like do like 30 minutes of foam rolling. Even if I don't even think foam rolling is like all the end all be all, but he did it every day. Like it's
just do something.
That's what makes those guys.
That was one of Krause's big things was just come in and do something, right? It doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just come in every day and do something. And I think as long as you're moving that needle just a little bit, you're at least it's going in the right direction, right? It's those guys that stop doing stuff. And well, I don't feel good. Let me go back and start doing stuff. And they just kind of, it's just up and down where just do something. I don't care what it is. Just move around.
Yeah. And again, like you said with the club, I think it's the same as a coach. Like that's one thing that I personally try to be live by example or lead by example is like, I don't like having bad days at work. Like I'm trying to be the same person, same attitude. There might be some days where I might have a little bit shorter fuse than some other days, but I try to be the same person all the time. So I think if we're going to tell our athletes they got to do it, then I feel like we have to lead by example too. So
100%.
Last couple of questions, we'll maybe kind of go like maybe a little rapid fire here if we need to.
All good.
What struggles did you have, going across your career, like early on, what struggles did you have? How did you kind of get better at those things? And then what are maybe some of the biggest takeaways and lessons that you've learned?
I think one of the things that I wrote down is the sun's going to come up tomorrow no matter what. Right. So I remember it was my first year where it was an A-ball. We were actually in Charleston, West Virginia at that beautiful ballpark. And it rained or something like that. And I couldn't get the pitcher sprints in. And I was just like, oh God, what's going to happen? So I called my coordinator. I'm like, well, they can't run today. What should I do? He's like, they'll run tomorrow. It's okay. Like you kind of have to go through things knowing that what you do that one day is not going to affect everything long term, but there are things that you can do that can affect them the next day, which can be negative, right? So, and that's one thing. Again, Matt Krause always said is like there will be a game at 7:00 tomorrow, no matter what, whether your players are there or not. So, and your job is to make sure that they're there. So, anything in the weight room, and I think this is probably good for young strength coaches, is as much of an impact as you think you're making, which you probably are making one, don't put it ahead of anything else, right? Because if you do something stupid in the gym with them and they can't play the next day, well, then you have not done your job, right? And I think being at the professional level, and as you kind of go up higher and higher and guys are worth a lot more money, you do that and you're not going to have a job the next day, right? You do something stupid with an athlete in the gym that is detrimental to their performance. That's not our goal, right? So I think it's being smart when it comes to that type of stuff, as far as knowing that your piece of the pie is just a piece, right? You're the strength and conditioning coordinator or whatever you are, but there's still a hitting coach, there's still a pitching coach, there's still a defensive coach, there's a base running coach, everybody has a piece of that has to kind of complete the whole thing. Now other people's pieces are going to be bigger than others, right? And you kind of, especially in the strength and conditioning world, you kind of get what's left over sometimes at the end of the day. And we used to see that a lot in spring training, is like by the time these kids were done with their days, like they had not a whole lot left. And it didn't make sense to Rigo and I to be like, okay, now we got a big old hour lift with these guys that have just been on the field for 9 hours.
Yep.
Right. So a lot of it was like, all right, well, we're going to do some correctives and some mobility today and try again tomorrow, because at the end of the day, they're going to have to get up and do the same shit. And if we would have just said, no, you have to do this lift because that's what's on the piece of paper, well, give it a week and you're going to have guys dropping like flies in the training room. Right. So I think that general approach of just kind of taking a step back and realizing that it's okay if stuff doesn't get in, right? If whatever's on the paper, I kind of think I wrote that in there, is that don't write anything in ink, right? Because it's going to change. I think that's kind of a little microcosm of rehab in a nutshell, I think, is when you're working with somebody, you better have 3 regressions and 3 progressions ready to go, because it's funny when we got some practicum students and they'll kind of walk around with me and doing rehab and stuff, and like they're like, you don't carry anything with you. Like, how do you know what you're doing? Like, you don't have a computer, you don't have a piece of paper. Like, no, I know I have a blueprint of, I would know what I want to do today, and then we're going to figure out if that can be done. Right. So maybe the knee doesn't feel great that day, so we got to regress. If it feels good, we can progress a little bit more. But I think I wasted enough paper and enough time like getting the perfect program ready for somebody, and then it just goes to shit, and you go, oh fuck, that was a waste of an hour right before. So I think that just comes with experience. There's not a whole lot you can kind of you can't build that in without being in the fight for a long time and kind of being in the trenches and being on the floor, which you definitely can't necessarily teach it quickly. But I think the other piece you can is just kind of learning to take a step back, and it's not the end of the world if everything that you plan that day doesn't get done.
Yeah. Well, and that's something I personally still struggle with, because like I love the idea of wanting to make an impact, and the assumption that we have such a chance to make such a big impact. But at the end of the day, like whether, the strongest guy on our baseball team squats whatever 550, if he can't hit a baseball, no matter what he squats in the weight room, it doesn't matter. Like,
doesn't matter.
So at the end of the day,
he better spend more time in the cage.
Yeah, like at the end of the day, he's not like I can only help him so much. Like, and at that point, it's no longer anything that I can do for him, other than maybe telling him, like you said, get out of the weight room and go up and hit some more. Like,
right. I think part of that is kind of going back to like the programming part of it is just give them what they're not getting.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, okay, you mentioned like a 500-pound squat, like he's strong, right? Yeah. Is taking it from a 500-pound squat to a 550-pound squat, is that going to move the needle at all for that guy? Or is getting in the cage or getting a little more bouncy or whatever it may be, more mobility, is that going to better serve that athlete, right? So it's kind of taking another step back and kind of looking at it that way too.
Right. And then I'll kind of combine these last questions because I think they're all related. So, what do you feel like, when you guys are trying to hire somebody, whether it was, back when you were at the Yankees still, or now at Acumen, and even whether it's the students you're actually trying to hire, like assistant strength coaches, like what are some things that you're looking for, and makes people kind of more hireable, more desirable to hire them? And kind of on the flip side of that, what are some things that you're finding that even if you do hire them, that they're lacking, or the reason you don't hire them is because they're lacking certain qualities or experiences? Like what are some of those things that, because like I said, I have a group chat of, I think it's 10 to 15 people that have either been former interns or former GAs under me, and they're all going to end up watching this eventually. What are some things that they all need to be maybe better at, or they need to leverage that they might already be good at to make them be more hireable?
Yeah. Honestly, I think the first thing, as easy as it is it's first impressions. It's just look the part, right? I mean, even with the practicum students and stuff like that, like we'll usually do like a big group interview to begin with. I can knock off half of them just the way they show up and what they're wearing, to be honest. Like if you're coming into a gym, right, and you're wearing a hoodie and sweatpants for an interview, you didn't put the time in to look the part. At least I would much rather someone be overdressed than underdressed, right? I'd rather you come in a 3-piece suit than underdressed. So that's again, that probably just goes back to some of the attention to detail type stuff. I would say from experience, I think the reason that I've been able to progress in my own career is get there early and leave late, which unfortunately, I think the trend the last 5 or 6 years, I would say, is work ethics have not been where they used to be, I would say. And that maybe it's some of us that like we need to probably change our end a little bit too. But I think that's a big thing is they're willing to do the job, willing to maybe stay a little bit extra. If it hits 4 o'clock and you're still in the middle of a team session, don't get up and leave. Like finish the team session first and then go. Right. And stuff that should be common sense, but sometimes maybe it's not. But also, like, if this is an industry that you want to be into, I think you have to kind of want to put the time in and reach out to people and build your network. I think you'd be surprised how many people are willing to talk to you, even it's something as simple as Instagram or whatnot, like shooting somebody a message saying, hey, do you mind jumping on a call or whatever, I have a question about this. Not enough people do it. So I think when people actually ask, older coaches are like, oh shit, if this person actually wants to learn, I'm going to help them. Right. So I think not being afraid to reach out to people that you look up to or whatnot, or kind of you like what their program is doing, ask them more questions about it. Right. I would much rather somebody call and say, hey, can I come in and shadow? Like, absolutely. Like, I can teach you that, because you know what, when a job comes up and we're at nowhere with candidates, well, I'm probably going to think about, oh, that person came in shadow, they were okay. Like, you put yourself at the forefront of people's mind just by showing interest, right? Like, it seems pretty simple and pretty easy, but it's, again, as a young strength coach, there's probably a pretty good intimidation factor with some of that stuff. That, oh, they don't want to do that. They have more than willing to help young strength coaches get rolling in this business, especially if they want to do this, because it's not for everybody. I mean, you can speak on that as well. Like, if you want to make a bunch of money, this is probably not the job for you. If you want, if you don't want to work very much, it's probably not the job for you. But when you find somebody that's like, no, I want to put the time in and I want to work 80 hours a week, like, sure, come on, like, we'll find a spot for you, you know?
Yeah. Well,
So,
you know, and obviously, again, everybody that's going to listen to this has heard me probably say this story, because again, as I started off the call by just going back to like thanking you and Rigo, and I still stay in touch with Rigo a little bit. I know he's not Leslie in the S&C business anywhere, but I still stay in touch with him. But it's one of those things where, like, you guys weren't hiring anybody, like back in 2017 when I walked in the office that one day and sat down, and Rigo was like, yeah, we're not hiring anybody. He's like, well, let's just chat. And then I think I ended up talking to him, talking his ear off probably for an hour or so. Yeah. And he was like, again, like, we don't have a position. We don't do unpaid internships. He's like, but you can come and keep shadowing. And then by the time that summer was over, he was like, hey, next summer, like, we're going to create like a paid internship position for you. And again, if it wasn't for me doing that and being willing to kind of just get out of my comfort zone and almost knocking the door down, like, I wouldn't have been able to then go get a job for the Rockies, and I wouldn't have had the experience to then go get the job at Fairmont State. So it's one of those things without doing those things. And, and it's funny about reaching out on Instagram, because like, I still get there's like a little bit of like nervousness almost, even when I reach out to the coaches that have less, like, we've had some of the coaches that have been on this call. You're the 19th call that we've done. And some of the coaches that we've had on here have been either former coaches of mine that are now, like, one of my guys works in the NBA G League as a strength coach. Like, and even when I message him, like, there's like still that hint of nervousness of like, what if he doesn't like want to like do me a favor right now? Like, what if he doesn't want to answer my message? Like, what if he doesn't want to answer my text? Like, there's still that nervousness. And again, we just have to, you can't be afraid to reach out and take those chances and do those things. Cause I definitely wouldn't be where I'm at in my career if I wouldn't have done those things. Like, that is probably, of all the things that I would say that I've done to put myself in a position to be successful, is being comfortable reaching out and being uncomfortable, like putting myself out there, because
be available.
Yeah. Well, like I said, that's all I got. I know we definitely touched on. I know Tyler definitely was going to ask questions about like the baseball side of things, and the rehab. Noah, do you have any questions for Coach Kicia?
Yeah, I got one. If you were to like create your ideal young strength coach and give him the right path towards one day maybe being an NFL strength coach, or a big FBS strength coach, or even a very successful private strength coach, doing one-on-ones and speed and agility and training and whatnot, what path would you have him take, and what would those steps look like in order to reach the very peak of strength conditioning? What steps would that look? What would the path look like ideally, is what I'm asking.
I think football is one of those things where you've kind of got to get into that pretty early. I think, as far as you got to attach yourself to somebody else, right? So I think getting in with the right people, and I think trying to find that right situation. I mean, you look at any of the big strength coaches that are in the NFL and whatnot, go look at how many other places they were before that, right? Like, some of them may have been at 6 or 7 different schools before, jumping around all the time. So you kind of have to know that going into it, right? Now, private sector maybe maybe a little bit different, where if you're trying to get into that, as far as a lot of that stuff is going to be combine prep, right? So you try to find some places that are doing that stuff, and I think a lot of that stuff's probably going to be down south. Probably Tampa's a good example of like kind of a hotbed for that right now. I think as far as combine prep stuff can be obviously a lot of fun, because I think you get to work with obviously the best of the best athletes, but it's cyclical, right? Because you're going to keep getting guys in every single year. So I think it's trying to, again, no different than this, reach out to those places and just say, hey, do you mind if I come down or whatnot? Or like, and even ask them, like, what's the path to work for you? Like, what would you say if I wanted to work for you one day, what would that look like? Right. And obviously a lot of it's networking, a lot of it's who you know, right? And I think it's kind of like Adam and I just spoke about, is if you don't reach out and create your network, the who you know is pretty small, right? But if you start to create that network a little bit bigger, it's like, okay, this guy came and did this, or he reached out, and he's been pretty consistent with this. Like, then it's like, okay, maybe it's not at that facility you want right away, but it's like, hey, there's a job open over here. Why don't you go take a look at that? Maybe work there for a little while, and then it may not happen right away, but there's seeds that you can plant that 5, 6, 8 years down the road could finally flourish and be like, okay, now I am where I want to be. But it's especially the positions that you're kind of speaking of, there's not that many of them. They're very well paid, but there's not that many of them. So it's you got to kind of find like, what's that path to get there. And I think it's just getting your feet wet, getting in the door, willing, again, basically everything we've spoke about before is be there, willing to put in the work and do things and kind of go that extra little bit to where it's, I want to be the guy that's going to take your job. And that's one thing, like Matt and Rigo always kind of told me as when I was coordinator and whatnot, is your job as a higher up is to do a good enough job that you could take my job one day. Like if I tell the guys here, if I get in a car accident tomorrow, one of you has to take over my job. You better be able to do it. Right. So I think being that guy, that kind of pseudo assistant without being the assistant, that's because if anything else comes up, where if another job becomes available, because then once your network grows a little bit, that person that you know, their network is a little bit bigger. People that they know, that network is a little bit bigger. So I've seen a lot of guys get jobs that you're like, how the fuck did you get this job? It's like, well, he knew him and he knew him, and this person had a good reputation through all that stuff. So again, it's kind of just touching basically on the same stuff that we all spoke about already, but it's just depending on what sports you want to get into. If football is one of those things, you just got to get in early and put in the time and get in the right situations and be willing to bounce around a little bit.
Okay, thanks.
No problem.
No, that's a good question and great answer. Well, Mike, I appreciate it. We'll let you go. Like I said, it's good catching up with you. Great conversation. Well. Like I said, I'm very grateful of all the coaches that have kind of been involved with my journey, and you're definitely one of them. So, like I said, I really appreciate it, and I'll stay in touch.
For sure. Sounds good. Thank you, Adam.
Yep. Everybody have a good one. Thanks.
See you.
All right. See ya.